Hi, everyone. My name is Paige Disler, and I'm an MFA intern. I will be your co-host for tonight's We'll Talk with Artists. Our digital discussion tonight is with abstract expressionist Elaine Weiner-Reed. Elaine is an abstract expressionist. Her art career began with an interest in translating our 3D world into a 2D world of color. She first began her practice by studying classical oil painting and then exploring water media. Several years later, Elaine discovered her love for acrylics and latex on canvas. Music is also a key component in her creative process. Elaine plays music in her studio and moves around different artwork as if she were dancing with her brushes. Additionally, I would like to introduce the host of our show, Will Scott. Will is an art historian with an extensive career as a photographer and former head of adult programs in the National Gallery of Art. He is uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between art and the public.
Thank you, Paige, for that introduction and for your technical support. I always need that, so I'm counting on you. And most of all, Elaine, thanks for agreeing to sit for the interview. I've known your work for a while. We've known each other for a while, and I've always admired it, but never really sat and talked to you about it. And I just found out before we went live that Elaine and I almost crossed paths 50 years ago. She and my wife got their BAs from the same university, but she's younger than me and my wife.
Not by much, probably.
Well, anyway, so it's really nice to have the chance to talk to you. And I think we have a lot to talk about because your work is so varied and you're very productive. I can just, if anybody goes to Elaine's website, just reads the first page, you can tell that she must be in the studio every day. I mean, everything suggests that that's what she's doing. And it's certainly the production I've seen. So why don't we bring up the first slide? And I want to jump right into something that Paige mentioned in her introduction. Elaine, of course, you know, all of you who are regular listeners, thanks for tuning in tonight live when it's such a pleasant evening for a change. You know that I do, and I feel that it's something that I can contribute from time to time, make connections between the guest artists that I'm talking with and the work that you might find in a museum where I spent my career. And when Elaine, when you described yourself as you do on your webpage, and as Paige did from gleaning that information there, as an abstract expressionist, this is the earliest piece that we've included in the PowerPoint. And it reminds me a little more of some of the earlier 20th century painters, like the German expressionists or Vasily Kandinsky or the Blauer Reiter artists. Are those names of the movements of the artists familiar to you?
Not really, and I'm going to take notes on them and get them from you again. I was painting actually at this time when I was doing watercolor, painting plein air a lot and just learning how to mix and study. So I was up at a workshop in Maine and I realized that what was more interesting to me, so I painted landscapes and all that, but I started looking at some of the characters in our group as we were having a demo, and I do furtive sketches of them. And then one day I just started painting figures like this. And what I tried to do with these was get the shape. So kind of a minimalistic face to say that less is more, but to see if I could change and transition and build form with color and shapes and try to make interesting shapes. I just knew when I did this at one point, I was in a workshop with Skip Lawrence and I out in the sun and I'm painting and he looks around, you know, because most people that know him know he has a great sense of humor. And he looks and he's looking for this figure that I'm drawing, you know, as a model there. And then he looks and he walks by and he chuckles and he just kept going. He says, "You found it, didn't you?" Yeah. And I think in everything that I've done, when I come to doing figures it feels like that's what it was all about, that everything brought me to that point in a certain medium. So, but just, I wanted to do the shapes and flatten them out. And I loved color. So this use of watercolor shocked people, I must say.
Yeah. Can you give us me and the listeners a little sense of the time frame, that the actual chronological passage of time that was covered by your work that let you realize this kind of painting that you were, I guess, describing taking place more or less at that workshop?
Well, and going back to the beginning of depicting or saying my world, trying to make my world in color. You know, I would start walking around and looking, and I've sketched my whole life. Etch-a-Sketch, you know, was my start, my sketchbook back in the day. And I would just try to make things or sketch things. And then but I didn't know how to do color. So in the 80s, actually, after I moved down to Maryland, I stumbled on an oil painting teacher, Eugene Kamalak, and his history. And we would paint every Saturday. And if anyone who does oils, you know this, it takes a long time. We mixed all of our colors, you know, from the primary colors. So, and then you try not to let them dry, because it took me, I don't know how many years down here till I got my first promotion in my job and could start to buy tubes of paint, you know, so I was my life on a loan. So, but it was probably from, I guess, mid 84, maybe 83, I started oil painting. And then, you know, you can't really travel with them. I'd make room for the palette in my fridge to try to keep them from dying, and mixing, you know, it was a whole, every Saturday, you know, for a couple of years. That's where I was on base in this little shack. But he was an Auschwitz survivor. And so I did not paint any figures with him at all, but I would just go to him with the pictures from Maine or something and say, I want to paint this boat. You know, it was on a grass up in Maine, you know, the old boats you see all around. And it was up on cinder blocks. And I said, but I want to paint it with smoke coming out of it. So as sailing across the grass, and I call it, you can if you think you can. And he just would start laughing, and he said, okay, honey, I help you do it. So he would just help me to mix, or how to do smoke. And I still have that painting, but getting to figures probably took about 10 years once I got into watercolor and water media, because I went through my.
So it took you about 10 years from the time you first started to try and learn to paint with the assistance of this fellow or some others to get to this point.
Correct.
You know, it's the reason I've kind of gotten hung up on what might seem like a trivial point. It might be a trivial point, but to me, it was interesting because the way the figures look here is very much the way in which some of the German expressionists in the first decades of the 20th century simplified figures and used such bold colors and bold color combinations in this way. And even more than that, some of the listeners I know, and perhaps you do as well, that Matisse went from really painting academically to painting like an impressionist to painting like a post-impressionist, and eventually found his own way, his own visual form of expression, where figures essentially had a heavy black outline and then were filled with larger areas of color. So they were nothing like what other people had done before, but they weren't quite yet like the dance or, you know, the blue nude or those more famous works. So it's like you followed a similar path in coming to create a vocabulary of form that's based purely on color. Is that fair for me to say about you?
Yes, I think it is. And I think for me, it was important to make the discoveries or push myself just intellectually and technically through trying to do this, trying to keep the colors, trying to different techniques. You know, I would do wet and to wet, or this was bolder and let them dry, and then see how the colors react against each other, what they say, how, you know, cool colors and shadows and subtleties of all that. And I think as we learn something, all of the vocabulary matters in different ways. But what's funny is just, you know, I mentioned the Etch-a-Sketch in later paintings we'll talk about, and you've probably seen the lines. It took me a while, and it's almost like the paper cuts with Matisse.
Yeah.
The easiest things, the first things we did, the things that come natural, we push aside for ages and don't touch. And maybe because it's too easy or seems too simple, but it didn't. I think it was about just 15 years ago I started putting line back in. It was tentatively at first, but back into my work, and then owning it again, kind of bringing it all together.
Well, everything that we've talked about, and particularly everything that you've said, has made what I'm sort of going to spring on you next, I think, made me more confident in doing it. And I hope you don't feel like I'm taking advantage. Can we have the next slide? You call this primal scream, and you call yourself an abstract expressionist. The art historian in me, when I first saw this image, I thought, well, that's like Willem de Kooning or even Jackson Pollock, as they're transitioning away from figuration into more abstract forms of painting. Were you aware of them, or is this a continuation of what you've already been describing?
A little bit aware, but generally I became more aware, and I started studying or looking up those people. And de Kooning I absolutely love, but I would stumble on them afterwards. If somebody would mention, that reminds me of a so-and-so, and I would look them up. This piece was when I was starting to get antsy. It was 2015, and I was missing my roots in sculpture. So at Westchester, I took 3D design, and I wanted to make things. And I don't know if that was the outlet, but clay I fell in love with, and I did some plaster and plaster and wire and polyester resin. We did on all those different things. And then, 20 years, and I missed it. So that more tactile drive in me wanted to come out. And also a little bit of a rebellion, I guess, with this canvas. And I just thought, what if? So I just tore holes in it, and I started wrapping wire around and through it and bringing it through, and then wrapping cloth and plaster on the wires. And it's a little bit hard to see. I think you can see a little bit of a shadow, but it's almost like bows and arrows of some sort. You can kind of see drawing the figures and the torsos together. But I actually, deliberately tried to do a trompe-l'oeil effect on this one, that unless you were there or looking or got next to it and saw that, oh my gosh, that's out 3 inches sticking there. What is this? And that was conscious, but I'll tell you, it was about 3 years in the making, because the more you do and the more surface you put on a canvas, it doesn't fight. It makes the dialogue more intriguing, I guess, to get to where you finally nailed it. So.
Well, this is a very powerful painting, I think, not just because of its colors, but the writhing forms and the vague sort of, I see mask-like faces that could be male or female, but there are other forms that are, I think, more, easily read as female rather than male. But, this just, to me, has an awful lot of the kind of inner turmoil and even violence that Gorky had, that de Kooning had in his work. Even Rothko, went through a phase where he was struggling with all of these kinds of issues, formal and personal. And you mentioned de Kooning, and you mentioned how much you admired him. De Kooning was an awful person.
I heard that.
and particularly awful to women.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make any difference to you at all? I'm just curious.
Well, I would not take them out of a museum for that because of what their art says, where they've taken the whole realm of art, perhaps. I think educating people on that behavior and stuff, that's really not acceptable, but it was not uncommon for men. I mean, Picasso was also kind of a pill just to put it mildly. But it's interesting with, I do want to read more about all of these different people, because that angst, this piece, I finally got it when I had been away on a workshop. I was out in California, and I flew back and learned when I hit the ground in BWI that my mom had died. So I actually finished this piece. It came together as I poured in everything else, and it had, I don't know how many different versions of different paintings are under here, but this finally completed itself in that 2-week period between when we, went up to PA to put her to rest. So, and that's where so it did get, I think you're,
Yeah, it's full
sense
of
of that.
energy, and now that you have shared that anecdotal, that personal connection, it really makes sense. I mean, I can feel, or at least now I can understand on a mental level, a cerebral level, where all of this tension and fierceness is coming from. This is just a tiny little aside. You mentioned going to Pennsylvania to put your mother to rest. Are you from Pennsylvania?
I am from Pennsylvania, south of Philadelphia. A
Where?
little town called Parkside, with 2 of the best hoagie shops in the world.
You're going to send me the address of the hoagie shops if you think they're still there, because I'm from just north of Philadelphia and always looking for a good hoagie shop.
Oh, where? Yeah, absolutely. They're still there with the Fill-In Gyms.
Phil
I'll
and
give you
Jim's?
the details at some
Okay.
point. Yes.
All right, I'll check them out the next time I'm up that way. But there's so much to talk about, I think, because just the way you're talking about these images that we've looked at so far, there's clearly a lot that's going in consciously and subconsciously into your evolution. But you're talking about the line, and I think most of us that are familiar with your work recently think of these figures that are mostly female, and they're very linear. That's their basic structure, but they're very unlike this image in the heavy impastos and the almost violent imagery. So how do we get from here to the next slide? I mean, this is classical, not just in the purity of the form of the white, memorial color. There's all kinds of different things that make me think this is so different than the image that was just preceded it. Now there's some good amount of time, but how'd you get here?
Well, this one I started wanting to play with not saying everything, that giving gesture, giving form. And the idea in this one was out of not necessarily the ashes, but as this woman starts to apparate and materialize, to become more solid, as she gains confidence, gets through different challenges. It's funny, well, a lot of these, started and all during my work career and life. And so, releasing tension, art is also healing for me in many ways. But as I was going through something at work and trying to make this peaceful painting, and this, that carries a message of hope. I always want to have a message of hope in my pieces that will survive. And that's what my art actually helps me survive many things, and not nearly as tragic as many people go through. But the angst and the pain or the loss. And so friends would sometimes share different things in their lives. And, what I've gone through pales in comparison to their own struggles. And so this became kind of a tribute to a friend of mine that's like the ever-ready bunny, that keeps on ticking and surviving so many things, and beautifully, right, carrying brokenness or healing or whatever, and kind of that Herculean strength and power. But doing this physically, there's a whole bunch of active and a whole lot more color and vibrant color under there. So many of my paintings do start with that same
Okay, but this is
undercarriage.
finished. To you, this is finished.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's 60 inches tall. Many women are not a lot taller than 60 inches. So it's almost life size.
Right.
And there's something metaphorical about it. I mean, it's like this woman is emerging as she's changing. Is that the way you want it to be read, or is it up to me to read it as I experience it?
Well, I do love to leave it open to interpretation. So what I try to do is not tell the whole story. It's as if you walked into a scene, and what would it tell you? What would precede it? How would you write the end of this story, right? Would she essentially come off the canvas, right? And walk or stand next to you and keep going, keep solidifying, evolving, and living. So this one, if when you look close, there's a lot of quietness and everything. If I painted it again, I'd probably I might do more color, and I have one that's all red as well. I call infrared. And so what I try to do as well is, with what I want to say, I think about how to control myself or stretch myself as well. So having a quiet one like this, that at least visually with limited palette, was important for me to say, to have that sense of just beautiful, graceful survival, I guess. If I
So
had
the
to
limited palette would stand out as unusual in your body of work.
Yes, I think so.
And when you did this work, or you do works of this kind, others that might be like it, are you using the black paint or ink first and then adding the washes, or does it not matter? They kind of evolve together.
They overlap. I sometimes start with just drawing with liquid paint, and then I'm painting over it, and I paint over it. I don't use projectors or anything in my work, at least not yet. I might get there at some point, but I like to imagine a scene. Sometimes I'll work from a little sketch. So I have a little 7-inch notebook, one of those moleskin, and I'll do a sketch or something in my mind, or have a photo and sketch from that. And then I don't look at that anymore, because I'm trying to imagine how it feels, what's being said, and what's important as a takeaway, I guess. So I did actually, ages ago, when I was in watercolor and water media still on paper, I realized that I had ignored all these neutrals. And I put all my colored palettes away, which I just found again, of watercolor, but I just had the browns and the tans. And as I explored that whole new world, a whole type of organic architectural landscape kind of evolved from that. And that was really fun. And then I gradually would allow myself, like, which color, and let me just start mixing in, but not too much of a good thing, if that makes sense.
On your webpage, you say that chance encounters are important to you, and the ideas of transience and imperfection. And that, I mean, that's what this image is to me. I mean, I'd like to think that if I just stood and talked to you upon seeing it the first time, that I would sort of flow that way, because you've done that so convincingly. But now this is a little bit of, I don't know whether this is a curveball question or not. Martha, who used to be the moderator, told me that I would throw people hardballs when they weren't expecting it. Braveheart in our popular culture is not only associated with a real Scottish historical, very violent warrior-like, figure, but now it's also, for better or worse, associated with Holocaust designer, very aggressively, almost misogynistic Australian actor. Does that bother you? Would you change the title? Do you think that has any relevance at all?
Not, well, I changed it to heart has a capital H. So I was playing with that, but essentially it was focused on the transient people's, the very personal struggles and,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
trials we go through. And that what's so beautiful in each one is that they keep ticking. They're
Yeah.
braver. We don't even know they're brave, right? These people that pass us every day, you, all of us, Paige, going through things, and that survival, especially when part of us is broken, whether external, whether it's visible. And as we age, we're only here for a little bit of time. So I want to try to honor the heart. So I don't think I'd change it. And if it makes them stop twice and then look or walk away, it really doesn't have anything to do with Mel.
Yeah.
Or,
Good. Good.
but actually, yeah,
And I hesitated to even bring it
that's
up
okay.
because the image does so compellingly do what you say you were intending. And I think the title in this case would be something I would not necessarily even notice unless I glanced, because I would be looking at the image, and the image is very compelling.
Well,
So
let me throw one at you. What would you call it, you think? How would you rename it?
metamorphosis, or something along
Yes.
those lines, something that would
Yes.
make the change factor a little more present.
God. What's interesting,
I'm not
is
good with
that
titles.
that's okay. Sometimes we struggle with that.
I know.
But on the website, if people go and look up Braveheart, they'll hear a recording. I think I've put it in there now, but of what some poets think about some of my work and how they interpret it. And recently in June, a show I had, this poet, Carrie Martindale, wrote a poem called I think it's Transitions.
Mhm.
And it's about a friend of hers who's going through a gender transition. And she asked me, did I mind her writing that? And I said, these are open to interpretation.
Yeah.
I invite and I love that, because that dialogue keeps it all alive, keeps us all thinking and learning different things. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Well, I hope I didn't mislead anybody or send anybody off on the wrong tact, because
Yeah.
this is a wonderful work and fully realizes what you were just speaking about. So let's look at the next image. I think this is one of the ones that's a little seemed more familiar to me, because it's the kind of thing I've seen you do a lot of recently. Yeah, The Gathering.
One sec, Will. I'm trying to get it to go over while I'm working with that. Elaine, Joan would like to know what medium you used in Braveheart.
Oh, and hi, Joan. Welcome, everyone. That is actually acrylic and latex. So sometimes I end up and if you asked what was what, I don't know if I'd be able to tell because I mix them all the time. So but a lot of times I like to get some of the little sample jars of latex, the house paint. And everything is fair game in my studio at this point. So, but I love it. I love how, because it mixes differently. It has a little bit of a different, more elasticity or rubbery stuff, and you just don't know what effects it's going to have. So I think it's part of the thing that keeps me pushing myself or trying to overcome the technical difficulties, I guess, if you will, of the mixing the different things together.
Elaine, this is an image that seems to me to have, and everybody should know that the artist always chooses the images. I may make a few suggestions in adding or subtracting something, but in this case, we're taking what Elaine so judiciously selected. And here, the note appears for the first time, I think, of red in the way that you're using it now. It's not like the earlier image where red just dominated everything, but red is sort of a keynote color now. And you have these groups of figures that are not drawn in a representational way. Are you right now grappling in your work of this kind with the experiences of a woman of your age, of your life experiences, negotiating this modern contemporary world? Because that does seem to be, again and again and again, I seem to see a woman or a few women that are in some kind of setting like the gathering. Well, this doesn't look like this doesn't look like somebody's engagement party or their retirement. So, I mean, it's kind of unsettling almost. How much have I over interpreted?
No, I think you pretty much nailed it. An earlier title for this was Judgment Day.
Oh,
And so, and then I thought, well, there's more at play, right? So when you're in a group setting or, again, work, what can I say? It was really a good work experience career, but often there are different dramas going on, or, you find yourself in one and it's like, exit stage anywhere.
yeah.
But I like the idea. And here I was playing with the, when someone is singled out. There was literally at work, it was during a period when different people I knew were bullied in different ways. So that's another theme I play on, that, oh my gosh, there are bullies of every age, right? So no matter, it's not just grade school that we're going to be bullied, or that someone will attempt that. So that idea of who clusters together in maybe a silent group. Should they speak up? Were they all of like minds? And sometimes I'll write poems on my website to my own pieces as well. But as she walks into the room, and again, that question of how would you write the script, right? Would someone else walk in and, it becomes a party, they're hiding and they're going to surprise, and it really turns into a good thing. Or in this case, should she sit down? Is that chair meant for her? How much power does an individual have in one setting? And so I try to play with that. Will she sit down? Because it's like, is this what I'm supposed to do? Or as if she walked in and doesn't know what to do in a situation.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and the red chair for me starts to take on more, I guess it's solidified in my, I've painted it before in watercolor. Actually, I'd done a red chair years ago, but the symbolism of it, I've done a poem called Red Chair Moments, and it's when you want to stop time, so that kind of is what it's become, that symbol of transience and time in a piece as well. And the empty chair, did someone just pass on? Did they go? Did somebody leave the chair, or is she waiting for someone to sit down again? Are there more chairs off camera or something? So those kind of things I would love, I'd love to see what a screenwriter did with this one.
Yeah. Well, while you're talking about the chair, of course, the chair is red, and red is a very dominant color in all of your work that I'm familiar with, except for some of the more recent things that we'll look at in a moment or two. So does red have a kind of consistent symbolic meaning to you, or is it simply a vivid color that helps you structure the pictorial space?
I love red. I really do. I love all shades of red. I love all colors, but red seems to be my color. I don't know if that's because I'm a fire sign or what, but that the meaning of it, because many people don't like red at all. So, I've learned in some conversations. So it's incredible to me, the power of color. And this could, turn off as many people as or more than would find, intrigue in it. So
you're using it more because it is a powerful color, not because it has some particular symbolic meaning that you're consistently referencing.
I tend to think of latent power, I guess, if you will, that it depends, it depends possibly who sits in it. Does someone sit in it? But red typically means, at least in many, I guess, circles, passion or life. It's kind of, you think of the sun and the moon or Mars, it's like, so juxtaposing the cool and the grays in this one, and the soft blues and some of the shadows with the red. I guess I wanted to be provocative in this piece.
I know there's more than we can talk about, in the 14 minutes that we have left.
Oh, boy. Okay.
So
All right.
let's quickly look at the next image, and then I want to kind of get, all right, flip one more, please, Paige, just so I can get a better, all right. Because these both are groups, and they're both groups that seem to be made up primarily of women, and the red chairs are present. Joan, do you think you can, Elaine, rather, excuse me, can you kind of wrap these together and talk about what's going on? Because I really want to at least introduce people to those three-dimensional things that you're doing recently.
Okay. I think the empty chairs an invitation, and my with this one, a lot of things were going through my mind. I had it, the big studio space at Maryland Hall, and it was thumbtack, well, nailed to the wall. But I was playing the music of Vanessa Collier, and the lines in her poet, were stop injustice, and some of the racial atrocities were going on in that year period leading up to that. And that just came across that change begins with each of us, so each of the figures, it's you and it's you and it's you and it's you. And in a setting, in a room, whether this is a family gathering, big party room or a bar or wherever it is, it all comes down to us and how we treat others, deal with things. And, through this big painting are words like respect. And so some of the words of, but stop injustice. And there's some French writing on the side as well. A lot of times that calligraphy is underpins and, it's kind of buried in my work as well. But here I also focused more consciously on not just having the universal faces or, that all neutral faces or pale faces. I really worked and played with having a diversity of skin color and tone, if you can kind of see that. And it was funny, one woman at the show it was in Baltimore County came up and she said, well, if I hadn't seen the title, I would think of this as a Jewish wedding. And I'm like, yay, because it's not an unhappy painting. It doesn't have to be a dense painting, but that consciousness of when, that we're all a part of society and we all have a role to play, an important one. So.
Yeah, so both of these, well, all of your paintings that I'm familiar with, where you have a group of people, it doesn't seem to be that you're trying to speak to an individual sort of event or experience or emotion, but more the human condition in general. And each person can sort of find the person that they would chat up, when you do go to a mixer or a cocktail party, there's always somebody that, there's just, oh, I wonder, do I know him or her? That's sort of what this painting does for me. I'd like to know who that is over there.
Yay.
Okay, I think somebody raised a hand. Paige, did somebody try to raise a hand?
So we do have a new comment, and that is from Jim. You are one of my favorite painters at MFA shows. I always look for your work at the shows I visit. It's great to finally be able to put a face to the work. I'm intrigued about your use of color, and it reminds me of the background colors of ancient religious icons.
Wow. Thank you so much.
That's a very interesting observation.
Beautiful.
I wish we had time to explore those kinds of things, but I think the remaining images are of three-dimensional objects, correct? Oh, we have this one. Okay,
no, you
the
can
only
skip
question. Over. It's called the only question. It's titled the only question. So you got to tell us what it is. What the question?
That and that can also be like, if you're looking at a child and you just say, I just have one question for you. But her sitting in the chair. This was painted over the COVID years, and that whole thought of, well, you see, she's occupied, she's sitting in the chair, is she frozen in the chair, and the juxtaposition of the figures, are they real or is it a painting on the wall, or are they almost as memories in that blue field in the back? And I'm still working on the role of the woman in white, kind of that kind of, did she just walk out of that blue background? Is she a memory, a person, or is she trying to enliven the space, and that she's going to make this lady get up out of the chair and go outside again?
So this is still a work in progress.
No, this is actually finished.
Okay.
But it's that whole dialogue of how do you
Mhm.
get there from here
Yeah.
and after
Yeah.
COVID,
Yeah.
and also the question of so many people faced, death and fears that we had not feared before through COVID. We've all lost people, we know, I'm sure. I'm sorry for that. But that was those struggles of, with my own mortality and fears and lost a dear friend. So it's again, where do we go from here? And you were saying earlier, I do try to think like, what do I need to say now? Like what, about every 3 years, give or take, I feel that I have to push or change and do some different things to be able to say what needs to be said. And I never want to have a thoughtless painting.
Well, I haven't seen one by you yet, so
Thank you. Thank you.
but that's a nice segue into what I'm going to do now, which is a little different from our normal procedure. And that is, I just want to show these last two slides. You can see that Elaine is working in 3 dimensions and with different materials. Next slide, please, just real quickly. And the art historian in me wants to just rip into both of these with all kinds of associations with different sculptors from different periods of the history of Western art. But there's so much to say about these, and I know you have other wonderful works, your paintings that you're creating now, that we could talk about. So I'm going to propose that sometime in the future, we bring Elaine back to look at particularly her sculptural pieces and maybe some of her more recent paintings. But we do have about 10 minutes. And there's still lots of questions knocking around in my head. So I hope there are plenty of questions out there in the audience if you want to ask them now.
Thank you.
I have not necessarily a question, but I noticed that with the initial gathering, with the woman with that red chair, it really made me think of Francis Bacon and specifically the Screaming Pope series. And I wasn't sure how you felt about that kind of comparison, because I feel like of all of the artists that we've talked about tonight, he's a bit of a different flavor as far as an individual person as, for example, de Kooning.
I need to look them up again, Paige. So thank you for what should I look up particularly, or a certain painting that you're referring to, or
So
where
it's
he
by
was coming from?
Francis Bacon, and it's a series, and it might have been the color, but the brush strokes were so carefully done in such a way that made it look like it was movement. But it's his Screaming Pope series, but it does
That's a
have
good
that
call,
kind of
Paige.
drama, that tension, that okay, do I sit down, do I move? And a lot of his Pope series were like painted almost as if they were in a box.
Yeah. That's a really good call. And I think that only adds to what I've been thinking, which is that, Elaine, you're really challenging yourself to take on serious topics in a serious way, but your work is still visually compelling. So it's, in my experience, that's a big challenge, and not everybody's up to that challenge. I've really enjoyed looking at your work and talking with you about it. Are there any other questions or comments that people want to share? See, I told you this would happen.
We do have one other comment. This is from Miss Nancy. She says, "Hi, Elaine, your work is stunning and profound. I love hearing the inspiration and meaning behind each piece." So thank you so much to Nancy and Jim and Joan for all participating.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, any questions, you can throw more curveballs at me, everyone.
Yeah. Well, for me, if there aren't any other questions, it's been a really worthwhile hour. And I'm glad you and I've had this chance to talk, and for me to get to know you and your work a little better. So I too look forward to seeing your work in our future shows. And I want to thank everybody for listening in, and thank Paige for her help, and Elaine for subjecting herself to this.
Well, thank you so much.
And as everybody knows, it takes about 2 weeks for us to edit these and get them up on the website, linked to our YouTube page, and then you can look at them as much as you like. And we hope you'll all take a chance to do that. So,
I see a question, Will.
oh, question.
We did have one just pop up. It is from Rob
Sorry.
Muir.
Okay,
Elaine, do you name your work before, during, or after your work is finished?
Good question. Many have the seed of a name in my head already. Sometimes so that I don't lose my focus, I'll have notes in my sketchbook, possible names that are coming through. Sometimes on the back of a canvas, I'll write it in pencil or something and then look back and say, whoa, got far afield on that one. So, and then I try to dial it back or do it or start a new painting that, finish that other thought. But sometimes I have to put a painting aside. So like Seule Question, I put it aside and I thought, should I call it something else? Should I? And I thought, well, as people look at it, they'll probably have their own questions and think, well, there's more than one question. But the meaning in the French meant something to me. So I thought I'll just keep it since she's got that kind of thought bubble up there with the word in her head. Kind of, are we going to survive this? But sometimes I actually have to live with a piece a while before. And on rare occasions, the titles change as well. But because you don't want to be too trite. And I also don't want to essentially lead the witness and say too much, because then I'm not inviting their imagination to the table. So
right.
I like that.
Well,
Thank you. Thank
Elaine,
you all.
thanks for sharing your time and your work with us this evening. And I hope everybody
Thank you, Will.
has a nice weekend.
Thank you too. Thank you, Will and Paige, and everyone for coming. Thank you.
All right. Good night.